I have tried to, throughout my life, get on with people who hold different views to me. That's why Yasmin Alabai-Brown is a friend. That's why I get on like a house on fire with Jackie Smith. I don't deliberately set out to make enemies of people who don't agree with most of the things that I believe in. And I think that's why I've only ever had one Labour politician complain about an interview with me. I've had plenty of Conservatives do it. Because they know that I'm going to treat them with respect. They know that they're going to get a fair crack, a fair hearing. And that's what it should be about. I'm not looking for gotcha moments all the time. I mean, I've had my fair share of news hits out of interviews that I've done, but it's not because I've deliberately gone into an interview thinking, I'm going to get you, you tosser.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. I'm delighted today to be joined by Iain Dale, the LBC presenter, who's got a new book out, which you should all check out. It's a cracking read, and we discuss his personal journey. There's a few memoir tidbits in this book that we discuss, but we also discuss that fundamental message of how we can actually disagree better in the age of Twitter. Check it out, give it a share, subscribe to this channel if you like it, and hit that little notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. Cheers. Iain, I've read your book, Why Can't We All Just Get Along? And it's a really good read. It's part memoir, which I like, and part analysis on where we're at, which makes it a much more enjoyable read than just, pure politics. And the analysis on where we're at as far as public discourse is concerned, I don't think anyone could disagree with. But my first question, and as I say, everyone can understand why you've decided to write a book on this topic, but to what extent is consensus even desirable, if it is at all achievable? And I'm thinking, the post-war consensus, for example, did that get us anywhere?
Well, I think it did initially, but nothing lasts forever. And I think consensus can be a good thing. I remember Margaret Thatcher always used to rail against consensus and wanted conviction politics. But I don't think that the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. I think everyone should aim for consensus, but recognize that sometimes it's just not achievable. If you believe in a socialist view of economics, you're never going to like Milton Friedman. I mean, there are some things where you're not going to achieve consensus. But one of the arguments I really try to center on in the book is that whatever your own views are, you've got to understand that people do hold different views, and that they've got every right to hold those views. And B, you've got to try and understand them, because if you don't understand your opponent's arguments, how can you possibly marshal your own arguments against them? And that's where I think things are failing at the moment in our public discourse, and I do think this is a bit of an import from the United States. If you're on the right, you watch Fox News. If you're on the left, you watch CNN or MSNBC if you're in the States. And we're getting a lot of that here now, where you will find people on the left will not listen to Nick Ferrari or me, and people on the right won't listen to James O'Brien. Well, this is a mistake, because if you just talk to people that you agree with and have your own opinions validated by people that you agree with, where does that take you? It's not very interesting. Surely the interesting thing is to debate people who disagree with you, and you try and win them around to your point of view. Now, that's not always possible. But one of the great things I've learned doing my radio show over the years is that there are people out there who will be able to persuade you. I have done on some subjects where I've started a discussion at the top of the hour with one view. It may be something that I don't know much about or don't have a strong view on. And then by the end of the hour, my callers have persuaded me around to another view. Now, James Delingpole would not find that very surprising, because he thinks I'm someone whose political opinions sway with the political wind. I mean, he may be right on some issues, but I think you've got to have at least the semblance of an open mind. I think people who are so certain of their views and so certain of their convictions are often quite dangerous people.
Yes, well, I mean, that was the one thing that was always said about Jeremy Corbyn, wasn't it? That he was a really principled man and his views hadn't changed since he was a student, or rather, since he was at was he at grammar school or a school anyway? And to me, that's not actually a very good reflection of the man. That's not a good thing to be so rigid and have been so rigid for your entire life.
I think politics benefits from having people who, some of whom are very ideological. I remember when I was your age, I used to go to Conservative Party conferences in Blackpool, and I would go to the fringe meeting of the Selsdon group. And Dr. Rhodes Boyson would give a speech, and I regarded as that as my annual injection of conservative philosophy, because he was a brilliant man. He was a former head teacher, became an education minister, was seen as very right wing in many ways, but he could explain conservatism in a way that I could relate to. And I've never been particularly ideological, but you kind of do need a little bit of ideology as a sort of grounding in your politics. And I think so. Politics on both sides needs a few people who are ideological, but you wouldn't ever want them to lead a political party. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn did come to do that.
I think one of the examples in the book that's quite good is when Greenpeace, they basically said we won't engage in debate because we've won the argument. And it strikes me that this is more prevalent on the left, or is that my own unconscious biases coming to the fore there?
I think it's a very conscious bias, Darren. Why did I call you Brian? I was horrified by that. This was back in 2006 when I was a host on an internet TV station called 18 Doughty Street, which is kind of akin to what you're doing, actually, with Reason. It was meant as it was an online TV station, and it was hosted by people predominantly on the right. There was me, Tim Montgomery, and Donal Blaney. That didn't mean we didn't have left-wing voices on it. We did, and we had one or two left-wing presenters, Peter Tatchell being one. But this station was about 10 years ahead of its time. If it existed now, it would be doing really well. And I wanted to have a debate on climate change. So I asked Greenpeace to come on, and they refused to on that basis that, no, the argument's already won. Well, the fact that this debate is still going on, and the scientific consensus may be what it is, but there are still people who don't believe that climate change is overwhelmingly man-inspired. So I have used that as an example, and I do think there are a lot of people on the left who are so certain of their arguments, so certain of their almost moral rectitude, that they can't conceive that there is another point of view on anything. They believe they are right and everybody else is wrong. And I don't buy into that. On Brexit, I like to think that I'm right. I believe I'm right, but I can't say that I know that I'm right, because we will wait to see what happens. In 5 or 10 years' time, people will be able to judge for themselves who was right on that argument. But I can't, with any degree of 100% certainty, say that I'm right on anything. All I have to hope is that I am right on more than I'm wrong.
How much do you think Twitter has actually ruined the debate? Because, you can't voice what I think vast swathes of the British public would view as quite a nuanced opinion without individuals accusing you of all kinds of isms and phobias. I mean, a good example would be the CNN tweet which said individuals with cervixes, and when people said, I think you mean women, there were accusations of transphobia flying around the internet. Yeah. And I wonder how much Twitter itself has actually poisoned the debate. And I mean debate in general, not just the trans debate.
I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with Twitter in that I am completely addicted to it. So I probably love it more than I hate it. But there are times when I would happily come off Twitter. I have to be on Twitter because of what I do, just as you do. But there are days, I mean, today is one of them. I've done an hour-long podcast with Yasmin Alibaya-Brown, with whom I agree on virtually nothing. But I like her. She's a friend of mine. I get on well with her. It's just one of those human things where we get on. Can't explain it, but we do. She is very left-wing on things where I'm quite right-wing on economic issues. But on social issues, for example, she's actually probably to the right of me in some ways. And whenever I mention her name on Twitter, it just goes mad, and my Twitter feed is unreadable from people just hurling the most horrible insults at her. Now, she is a controversialist. She is a polemicist. And she sometimes doesn't help herself in some of the things that she says. I completely get that.
Yes, I've
But
done your show with her before, Ian. Say no more.
oh, you have, haven't you? But nobody deserves the level of vitriol that
I
she
agree.
gets. It is disgusting. Some of it is motivated by out and out racism. And people pick on. I mean, she wrote a stupid column once, and she herself now admits that it was stupid, saying she would leave the country if Boris Johnson became prime minister. And whenever I mention her, oh, hasn't she left the country yet? Well, that's not very original. I mean, it's actually very boring. And oh, she hates all white men. She's actually married to one. I mean, get over yourselves. This woman is allowed an opinion just as anybody else is. And I hate that side of Twitter. And there have been several occasions recently. I mean, the one involving you in recent times where I could not look at my Twitter feed for 2 days because it was just so disgusting. People attributing motives to you, which you just don't have. I know you're used to that as well. And it becomes a thoroughly unpleasant place. And I remember once, I don't know, it was about midnight. I was in bed, having a laptop on my pillow, and I was having some argument with something that probably was a Russian Twitter bot. And you think, what are you doing? This is ridiculous. And there is no sense of nuance on Twitter. You're either in a tribe or out of the tribe. Something's black or white. There are no shades of grey. And I mean, that Twitter helps public discourse in one way, in that it gives access to a platform to ordinary people, whereas 20 or 30 years ago, if you were an ordinary voter in Scunthorpe, you might write to your local paper once every blue moon and get it published. Nowadays, you've got blogs, you've got Twitter, you've got Facebook, all sorts of platforms where you can put your views forward. Now, that's a great thing. It's a democratizing thing, but it's also turned out to be a very dangerous thing where it gives access to absolute idiots. Now, okay, idiots deserve their voice, I suppose, as much as anyone, but some of them, I mean, it does make you lose your faith in humanity sometimes when you see what people say.
I mean, in the context of that, you've mentioned, again in the book, that anonymous accounts, on one of your prescriptions to make discourse better would be to ban anonymous accounts. Now, I wonder, are you not at all concerned about the repercussions or the consequences of that for anonymous whistleblowers, for example?
Well, there must be a way of doing it. I'm not saying that you have to put your full name on the Twitter so it's visible to other people, but there must be some way of organizing it so you don't get these bots. I mean, look, these companies spend millions and millions of pounds on developing the technology. Surely there is a way to stop bots being able to infest Twitter like they do. You don't get them on Instagram. Don't think you get them on Facebook to the extent that you do on Twitter, because in the end they will eat Twitter, because there will come a time when people think, well, I've just had enough of this. We saw it with the whole Wiley situation, where I didn't think Twitter. I'm not in favour of. I'm not generally in favour of cancelling people in the sense that word is now being used. But nobody has a right to go on a public platform and say the kind of things that he did. Now, there are people who think that, well, anything should go and that you should debate with those people, but you can't. It's impossible. And we will all have a different area where we would draw a line. And my line was that I couldn't understand why Twitter didn't take the kind of action against him that they would take against someone who expressed an overtly racist view. If he was a white singer making those kind of comments about a black rapper, we all know what would have happened. And that's where it's so insidious. So, I mean, the whole free speech debate, I mean, you can be absolutist on it. And you've obviously got Toby Young's organisation, which is about as absolutist as you get. And I think they do a valuable job, actually, because you have got to have people defending free speech, because otherwise we know what happens. We're seeing what's happening in our universities at the moment in terms of no platforming. But you can't argue that someone like Amber Rudd should be no platformed. I mean, Amber Rudd is about the antithesis of being an extremist, and yet she was banned from speaking at Oxford University just because she happened to be a Conservative politician. I mean, it is outrageous. This was going on when I was at university in the 1980s, but I think it's actually got worse now.
Well, exactly. I mean, I can't, and this isn't a dramatization, which would be very like me, but it really isn't. I get a lot of emails from students up and down the country, but I've had a couple from Leeds University, and they always say the same thing, which is that they'll book a Conservative MP to come and speak. The venue will be secured, and then like clockwork, it happens where the diversity teams and students will say, well, actually, you can't have this speaker at this venue. The venue booking is cancelled, and then they can't secure any other form of venue to host this Conservative politician. And to me, that's a pretty depressing sign of where we're at as far as tolerance and the forward in debate is concerned, where a democratically elected Member of Parliament can't come and address students at our supposedly world-class universities. That's terrible for advancing debate, isn't it?
Well, it absolutely is, but it's not just at the odd university this is happening. This is happening all over the country. I remember in 1983, Cecil Parkinson came to UEA, where I was a student. I was the chairman of the Conservatives, and he had been a cabinet minister in the Thatcher government, but had resigned over. He'd got his secretary pregnant. And this was all part of his rehabilitation program, I guess, going around universities. And we walked into the lecture theatre. It was full, 900 students there. And he got a huge round of applause. And I was thinking, wow, I wasn't expecting this. So he starts his speech, which was on a very boring subject on international trade. And his wife was on the platform. The MP for Norwich South, John Powley, was there, and me. And halfway through his speech, eggs started to rain in. They hit his wife and me. None of them hit him. He went ballistic. So, which dirty rat threw that at my wife? How dare you? And at that point, I was aware from behind that there were people invading the stage, and it was, of course, the Socialist Workers' lot. But luckily, I'd had the foresight to place some members of the rugby club behind the stage. So, should we say they dealt with that quite effectively? And actually, it was one of those quite rumbustious meetings that it was quite enjoyable. But the left tried to stop it happening because they saw that it was really successful, that there was a huge audience there that wanted to hear what he had to say, because he was a major player at the time. And it was an object lesson in that you have to stop the left winning these battles, and we did. Mm-hmm. And it had, there was also, I should say, the 83 election, that was the first general election I played any part in. And UEA in those days was an extremely left-wing university. But on the campus during the election campaign, all of the shy Tories came out of the closet and they put Vote Conservative posters in their windows. And the Labour Club they could not believe what they were seeing. I mean, it was a sea of blue. And this is where you have to be very careful of Twitter, because Twitter does not represent public opinion, and nor do student politicians. And I was convinced on election day in December that Jeremy Corbyn was heading for a landslide because of what I was reading on Twitter. Well, we know what happened.
Absolutely. How much do you reckon that, and you touch on, you do say in the book that you're quite envious of people with faith, right? And I wonder how much then, if we reflect on religion for a second, how much has that meant that we seek faith in other causes? And what I mean by that is, with the NHS worshipping that we experience at the minute, with Extinction Rebellion, they've got almost sort of like what can only be described as like satanic rituals every time they have a protest. And even, I think, to a large extent, the FBPE mob on Twitter, right? It's seeking a value system in something bigger than yourself. And now that a belief in Jesus Christ has dissipated, they're looking for other avenues. Am I onto something, or do you think I'm way off?
I mean, I've always considered all religions to be a bit culty. And I can remember at university, I could see what a lot of my friends got from religion. I thought, well, there must be something in it. But the logic, even though I'm not a scientist, the logical part of my brain tells me that there cannot be any form of superior being. There cannot be an afterlife. So until someone proves to me that there can be, I can't believe in it. But of course, that's what faith is all about. You have faith that there is. And I do think that religion is used as a bit of a crutch for a lot of people. It's also used for some degree of self-validation. I think religion is used also, some religions more than others, as a way to keep people in line, to make people feel guilty about any so-called bad behavior that they've indulged in. So I try at university. I used to go along to what was then called the chaplaincy. It's now become the multi-faith centre, and I would try and understand what all my friends got out of it, but it never happened. And they said, "Oh, you should go on the Alpha course," and all these sorts of things. And I just thought, no, I don't want to. Now, political parties, in a sense, are a bit culty. Conservatism, socialism are, in a sense, I suppose you could say, were pseudo-religions. But I do think religions can be very rewarding for people, but they can also be very dangerous as well. They can almost promote conflict between groups of people, and I think we've seen lots of examples of that. But am I envious of people who have a religious belief? Yeah, I am slightly, because lots of intelligent people I know are incredibly religious, and I don't see how they can square that with a lot of the other things that they say or do, but they quite happily do, and good luck to them.
Now, I'm interested in your thoughts on the diversity of the media, because, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you believe that actually it's allowed politicians to escape scrutiny, right? Because when there were fewer channels, they didn't have enough of a chance to secure a softball interview from another interviewer somewhere, like Boris Johnson escaping Andrew Neil, for example. And I wonder, is that entirely down to, they don't want to end up trending on Twitter after saying the wrong thing? Or is it just a sign of politicians are actually able to escape harder questioning?
I think it's a mixture of things. That there is a real diversity of media now. If you look at just speech radio stations, 15 years ago, politicians would make sure that they appeared on Radio 4 and Radio 5 Live, and that was it. LBC was seen as a London station, and it would have a few backbenchers on from time to time, but it wasn't seen as in the National Premier League. Well, now, we went national in 2014. I think we get more cabinet ministers on than 5 Live do. They often do us to the exclusion of 5 Live. You've now got Talk Radio that's appeared, and more recently Times Radio. Now, they have comparatively tiny audiences, but if there are presenters on those stations that the spin doctors think that they might get an easier ride from, they're probably more likely to go onto those than they are somewhere else where they know that they might get a much bigger grilling. And I think it is a really unhealthy development that politicians do try and pick and choose their interviewers. I think boycotting particular programs is fatuous. Boycotting particular channels is fatuous, because look at it this way. If they don't put politicians up on these channels or programs, who do they think is going to explain their policies to those programs' listeners? Because there used to be a whole cadre of sort of right-wing pundits like Tim Montgomery, me, a few others, who would go on and effectively be, even though we weren't of the Conservative Party, people saw us as people who would put forward a Conservative point of view, or the view of Cameron's government or whatever. That happens a lot less now. And they haven't got sort of surrogates. I mean, I didn't ever get Downing Street ringing me up saying, "Oh, can you go on this program and can you say this?" Not at all. And I was critical of some of the things that they were doing, but I was largely putting forward a pro-Conservative voice. Now, that has changed. You don't have so many people doing that at the moment. And I don't think they've cottoned on to the fact that if they don't put forward their own views, there isn't anyone else that's going to do it for them. And I mean, when I did all of those leadership election debates with Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt. And the first one, if you remember, was in Birmingham. And the day after, there was all that fuss about him and Carrie and the row and everything. And I knew that would probably be the last time that I would ever interview Boris Johnson, because I obviously had to ask him about it. And I have never interviewed him since. Now, that may be a coincidence. I may do in the future, but I don't expect to. When I did an interview with Theresa May, where I asked her how she would vote in a second referendum, and she was so horrified she couldn't answer the question, and I never interviewed her again. Now, this is the approach of the playground. I like to think that I'm fair in interviews. I don't go in looking for a gotcha moment. And I think too many interviewers do that, I have to say. I don't even treat interviews as interviews often. I treat them as conversations, because I think you often get more out of people in that way. And that's why a lot of people think I'm a soft interviewer, because I'm not gratuitously rude to people that I'm interviewing. But I mean, I interviewed Ed Davey the other day, and I wanted to basically say to him, "You are as boring as fuck, and you're not going to win the leadership, or you're not going to be an effective leader because you are a charisma-free zone." Well, that would have been a pretty horrible thing to say to somebody, even though it's probably true. So I found a way of saying it in a way that wasn't offensive to him. I said, "Look, how can I put this politely? But some people think, Ed, that you are a bit of a charisma-free zone." And he actually gave a really revealing answer to that by droning on about climate change, which kind of made my point for me. But there are ways of doing these things. You don't, if as an interviewer, you go in with your first question effectively saying, "You're useless, aren't you ashamed? Why don't you resign, Minister?" And okay, nobody ever does it quite like that, but the implication is there. The shutters go up immediately, because politicians, believe it or not, are human beings. And if you're under attack, your defences go up. You're just going to come out with pre-prepared sound bites, and the listener is the one that is cheated, and it's the interviewer that has led to that happening, and it shouldn't happen like that. So there's nothing wrong with asking a softball first question to get people into it. And I love doing longer interviews, because you can really get things out of people then. And often if you're doing a half an hour interview, your newsline comes in minute 27 or minute 28.
Well, that's exactly what I was about to say. You are really quite fond of the long form interview, and I think it's your view, and the reason for that, the reason you are a champion of the long form interview, is because actually you find the whole, and this is me speaking for you, so please do tell me to bugger off, but you find it really quite patronising actually that the media now, looking for those gotcha moments, and, over 10-minute Sky discourse, for example, reckon that we're all too thick or too lazy to handle a full, half an hour interview?
Well, I'm sure there are people that are like that. But and on a breakfast programme or drive time programme, you've got to have pacey interviews. You can't do a half-hour interview on a breakfast programme, for example. I completely get that. But I think people have become much more politically aware in recent years. I think that's the great thing about the internet, in that it does allow people to learn more. The diversity of our media enables people to learn more. But we've got to treat our audiences with respect. And if I'm doing a phone-in on a difficult subject on the radio, I mean, for example, I did a phone-in on the Indian caste system. I know nothing about the Indian caste system. All I knew was that it was sort of a bit like the class system, but more so. So you treat it as a sort of educational hour for you and the rest of the audience. So you invite people to phone in who do know something about it and who can share their knowledge with the audience. And that can happen on all sorts of things. And I think in Corona, in these lockdown times, I think this approach has been absolutely vital, because people view the radio presenter as a friend. And I think there have been a lot of people who found lockdown incredibly troubling, become very anxious over it. And you are one of the constants in their life, because they listen to you hopefully every evening. And they do see you as somebody that, even though they've never met you, they kind of know you. And that's why, as a presenter, I was given some really good advice when I started. Give of yourself. Let people know who you are, something about your private life. So if somebody stops me in the street who listens to the programme, they will know that I support West Ham United. They'll know that I have 2 dogs. They know that I drive an Audi, all sorts of inconsequential things. But it gets that bond between you as the presenter and them as the listener.
Mm-hmm. That's nice. And it strikes me that the format that works, right, is the any questions format, and the format that doesn't work is the question time format. Because any questions, I think, more times than not, shines light on a subject, whereas all question time seems to do is shine heat on a subject.
That is so true. I've only been on Question Time twice. The first time, really enjoyed it. It was a good panel, a really engaged audience, and it went off very well. The second time, it was the first week they were back last September, when Boris had prorogued Parliament. And it was a live show, which is unusual for them, and it was in London. So I did my evening show, finished at 10, whizzed over to the venue in Westminster, and literally.
Is this when you almost walked off?
Yeah. And I was with 5 minutes, and I was on the stage. So there wasn't that sort of. I'd never met Fiona Bruce before. I knew all of the other panelists, but it just became a complete bun fight, and it was a horrible experience. And I did think about walking out, because I thought, what's the point of being here if all I was next to Iain Blackford, who I get on very well with, and he's a very sort of nice, urbane man. He's actually very funny in private, which doesn't always transmit in his interventions in the Commons. And I can't remember what we were talking about, but I started to give my answer. He interrupted me after 3 seconds. I started again. He interrupted me after another 3 seconds. And then when he did it a third time, I just sort of threw my hands up in the air rather dramatically. I said, what is the point of this? I said, this whole programme, everybody has just been barging in on each other. Everyone watching at home will be incredibly frustrated by this, because the audience then start clapping. I'm not going to blame Fiona Bruce, because it was the format of the programme that was wrong. There were 6 panellists this time, and out of 60 minutes, and they did it because it was all about Brexit, and they had three Remainers and 3 Brexiteers, which, I mean, let's face it, for Question Time, that's quite a coup.
Yeah.
But I counted it up, which I wouldn't normally do. But the Brexiteers got 15 minutes out of these 60. The Remainers got 23 minutes. The audience contributions, the Remainers got 7 minutes. The Brexiteers got 2 minutes. Out of 60 minutes, I got 4 minutes. Now, you can say, well, you should have imposed yourself a bit more. But it just looks awful when all you're trying to do is butt in on other people. So Layla Moran and we didn't do that. But you had Iain Blackford, Kwasi Kwarteng, Emily Thornberry, and Richard Tice. And it was just a bun fight. And the audience were completely cheated.
Yeah. Now, staying on political discourse and in campaigning, you mentioned how MPs nowadays in the Commons, whenever you stand up and give a speech, it used to be that the Commons was full of people like Peter Shaw, for example, who fantastic orators. And now it's all about the social media clips. It's all about securing that 2-minute clip for your Twitter account. And you also talk about the death of control from the centre, the party machinery being able to micromanage campaign messaging and all of these various things. But I wonder to what extent, though, you think that the new Labour PR manufacturing style of politics, the death of that is actually probably quite a good thing, isn't it?
Let's not kid ourselves. There is still a large degree of control from the centre. Downing Street controls everything that every minister does. There are very few that will go rogue and decide to do their own thing. And I'll give you an example. I had a text from a cabinet minister a few weeks ago saying, look, we've got this new policy coming out. I'd really like to come on your programme and do a phone-in on it. So I said, yeah, great, happily do that. It was a very important issue. I'm not going to say who it was. And then I see that this cabinet minister has announced it in a Sunday newspaper and is on, shall we say, another radio station that has bugger all listeners. So I text him and say, really disappointed that you have gone on this radio station to talk about this. Thought you were coming on to do this with me. And he said, well, it's all controlled by number 10. And I said, no, you're a cabinet minister. If you can't decide which media you do, what's the point in being a cabinet minister? I didn't get a reply to that one. And I do think that, okay, number 10 need to control a grid. They need to know what their ministers are doing. But it's just the way they're doing it at the moment is completely wrong. Now, I think the idea of having a number 10 spokesperson is actually quite a good one. But again, they're getting it wrong because they're going to have to report to Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane, not to Boris Johnson. They're not going to be in the room when anything happens. I think we've gone, haven't we?
No.
Oh, somehow I've come back on the screen. I can't see you.
Oh, I've got it. You can see me now, right?
Yeah.
Oh, it was supposed to be like this all along. It's clearly just decided to switch. This is how it will actually look in post-production.
Okay, right. So where shall I start from again now? I can't even remember what I was talking about now.
Well, hang on. Why don't we move on to the next question? You got now. Hang on. You got through this cabinet minister, and you do believe that the party still has to command things, but actually, this is creating a really, I guess, chilling effect around cabinet ministers being able to actually speak and have opinions because everything is so heavily controlled.
Yeah, and they know that if they step out of line, they will be demoted in the next reshuffle. That's always the threat. But there has to be a happy balance here. And I think all governments go through this. I think the Cameron government got it just about right in terms of allowing people to do a little bit of freelancing stuff. But Theresa May's government, and certainly Boris Johnson's government, is far more restrictive than any that I've come across before.
Now, you also give quite a robust defence of capitalism and entrepreneurialism. And I just read a letter before I did this, actually, because that chapter reminded me of this letter, and I wanted to read it, by Jeff Bezos from Amazon to the US Committee on the Judiciary. And it was really beautiful, actually. It talks about his, migrant family who struggled all of their lives, and then he comes along with this idea to sell books online. And people were like, it'll never catch on. And of course it did. And I wonder, why can our politicians here not speak in such eloquent and almost poetic terms about the robust strength of our economic system and wealth creators?
I think partly because very few of them have had any real experience in the world of business. I think a lot of them almost have to be told what to say, which is just pathetic. And I know at my ripe old age, I probably hark back to the past too much, and you automatically think that things were better in the good old days. But I cut my political teeth in the late 70s, early 80s, when you had think tanks who were actually making the case for capitalism. Because over the previous 20 or 30 years, there was a Butsker-like consensus that Britain was effectively in managed decline, that socialism was something that was a good thing for the economy. Well, we found out in the late 1970s that was not the case. And there was the intellectual capacity there to put the case for capitalism and free markets. The Institute of Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, Aims of Industry, many Centre for Policy Studies, they were all at the vanguard of doing this. And I think today's think tanks tend to get sidetracked onto individual policy issues rather too much. And they produce some great work in many ways. But what they're not doing is putting the ideological case for capitalism and free markets. And somebody's got to make that case, because if cabinet ministers aren't doing it, if leading Conservative politicians aren't doing it, they will have to do it. And in the 80s, you had Keith Joseph, you had Margaret Thatcher, you had all sorts of leading politicians who were able to put the arguments in terms that ordinary people could understand. It wasn't just putting forward a theoretical ideology. But I don't see in the current cabinet, Michael Gove, I would say, is about the only one that I can see that could do this. but isn't really doing it. Not necessarily his fault, but he's got quite a lot of it on his plate at the moment. And I was really worried in the Jeremy Corbyn leadership that they were making the running on these sorts of issues. They were convincing people that a hard left view of economics was the way to go. Now, people didn't fall for it, but I think that was more to do with the ridiculousness of the level of promises that were made at the last election, and indeed Jeremy Corbyn's extremeness that put people off. But we have a Labour leader now who I think could be equally dangerous in terms of some of the economic policies that they want to put forward, but actually is to the electorate will be seen as perfectly reasonable and someone that they can do business with. And the Conservative Party, I don't think, has quite woken up to this yet. And okay, they say, well, we're 8 points ahead in the polls. Well, let's see if you're 8 points ahead in the polls this time next year.
Well, and Keir Starmer's personal polling is actually quite good. So...
Well, it is. And I think, look, if you're Keir Starmer or his advisors, you would be very happy with the position that you're in from his point of view. The Labour Party is polling way behind him, but that's not necessarily a disastrous thing at the moment in the electoral cycle. But he is a credible figure. He's somebody that doesn't frighten the electoral horses in the way that Corbyn did. And I can remember when Blair was elected in 97, obviously I didn't vote for him, but I do remember thinking, well, I don't think that he's going to be bad in terms of embarrassing this country in the way that Neil Kinnock would have done if he'd become Prime Minister. And there was a slight sense of excitement, even among those of us on the right at the arrival of Blair. We could see that he could potentially be a really good Prime Minister, because he wasn't trying to not totally undo the Thatcherite legacy. I mean, some people described him as the son of Thatcher. I think Margaret Thatcher herself said that her greatest achievement was making Tony Blair possible.
Now, I want to get a bit more personal now for this last part of the interview. And my first question has to be quite reductive, but what the hell was CompuServe Forum dating?
It was the grinder of its day, I suppose.
Oh, right. Okay.
I mean, it was basically, look, I didn't, how shall I put this? I think I was slightly older than you when I lost my gay cherry, so to speak. And how can I put this tastefully? I made up for lost time over a few years in the 1990s. And you had these sort of, because, I mean, think about it. The internet had only just come into existence. And where did gay people meet? Okay, I was never particularly one to go to pubs and clubs. You could go to gay saunas. Public toilets were the place where traditionally over the decades, because that was the only place that they could meet. So the internet provided a lot of opportunities, and CompuServe was bought by AOL. And I mean, a lot of people had CompuServe email addresses in those days, and they had these forums, effectively like notice boards, but you could have online sort of real-time chats with people. And that's right. I mean, that is actually how I met my partner, because I had this is getting very seedy. I had a one-night stand with a guy called Matthew, and we were sort of chatting away sort of after the dirty deed. And at the time I owned a car that had been owned by Princess Diana, an Audi Cabriolet. And he said, I've got this friend who'd really love to see your car. And so he brought this friend up 25 years later. Here we are still together.
Wow. Now, your coming out story, I actually found it quite moving to read, to be honest, in that particular chapter in the book, especially the story about your mother. And I wonder, do you have any thoughts or reflections on why it's still difficult despite the fact, same-sex marriage was probably, in my eyes at least, the last hurdle as far as legislation's concerned to achieve parity, equality with your heterosexual counterparts. But why is it still difficult to come out even in this day and age?
Because you're still seen as different. Even though, I mean, to me, being gay is perfectly normal. There have always been gay people. It's not as if you or I chose to be gay. I know for a fact I was born gay. I always knew I was different. I wouldn't have articulated it in any way, but even at the age of 7 or 8, I knew that I was a bit different. And even though, I mean, I did have a lot of girlfriends up until literally I was 28, but I always got to a point where I never went further with them. And I think for mothers, it's actually more difficult than for fathers in a strange sort of way. It's because they then think, oh, I'm not going to have any grandkids.
Yes.
And that matters. It really does, no matter how you spin it. And I didn't come out to my parents until I was 40. And the only reason I came out to them then was because I decided I wanted to be an MP. And I thought, well, I have to tell them. I can't let them read about it in the Daily Telegraph or something. And I'd sort of rationalised it to myself. Well, if I get through to the second round of a constituency interview, that's when I have to tell them. So the first one that I applied for was Chipping Barnet. And I did get through to the second round, having told the selection committee that I was gay, because they asked at the end of the interview, is there anything about your business life or private life that could bring embarrassment to the association? And apparently I didn't realise they asked that to everybody. And so I just said, well, I hope it's not embarrassing for you. It's certainly not embarrassing for me, but I'm gay. But you should also know that I'm a West Ham supporter, which is probably more of a problem in North London. And they all laughed. And I thought, well, that went well. And the agent, who was also gay, ran out of the room after me and said, what the bloody hell did you do that for? And I said, well, they asked me a question, so I answered it honestly. He said, well, you've just lost 2 votes there. So I went home thinking that I wouldn't have got through, that it was all a disaster and what a fool I'd been. I did get through to the second round, but I was 2 votes off getting into the final. And in those days, if you were a bloke in the final against 2 women, you virtually always won. So it could have been me in the House of Commons rather than Theresa Villiers if I hadn't done that. I don't regret it because I do think you have to be honest. So anyway, at the second round level, I then went up to my parents and had the conversation. And my dad, who was always really good in a family crisis, took the view, well, whatever makes you happy. My mum, I looked into her eyes and I saw nothing. And my mother was the sweetest woman. And I sort of said to her about John. She said, well, I know he's your friend. I said, no, it's more than that. And then the penny dropped. And I think I put this in the book. Maybe I didn't. So I'll say it now. But the next day, my sister rang me up. And she said that my mother had said to her that morning that she wished she'd never woken up. Which I found very difficult. Yeah. And I can't understand why my sister actually ever told me that. Yes. Because it really was a dagger to the heart. Mm-hmm. Now, we never really talked about it ever again. They knew John. John had been to stay at their home and they liked him. And after that, nothing changed. He was always made very welcome. But I know that I hurt her incredibly over that. So I wish I'd done it a lot earlier now, because there were also friends from university that I had effectively lied to for a lot of years. But I didn't lose any friends over it. I mean, there was no one that reacted really badly to it apart. Well, my mother didn't react really badly, but it could have gone better. But all my friends, I mean, half of them said, well, yeah, we already knew. And the other half said, well, so what? I mean, is that going to change our view of you? No, it isn't.
I think from my own, I was effectively, I came out very early. I was about 13, but it's because I was basically beaten out of the closet at school, right? And I remember telling my mother, and I was terrified because there was one comment that stuck in my head that she'd said when I was a kid. And Graham Norton was on the telly, and I said, I must have only been a child, and I pointed at the telly and said, Ma'am, why is that man funny? And she said, oh, he's gay, pet, you don't want to be like that, or something like that. And it stuck with me. Now, why did that one comment stick with me for so long, to the extent where when I was 13, I was absolutely terrified. So she went off with an ex-boyfriend to Northern Ireland, and I thought, right, now's my chance. So I sent her a text message saying, Mother, I'm bisexual. And she didn't reply. And I thought, oh, right, well, that's me done. I best pack my bags. And she texted back and she said, sorry, have had no signal in over here. I would love you even if you were an alien. And I thought, okay, well, right, okay. I think that's the best we could hope for, really. So it was good, but that leads me on to, I think you credit Anne Widdecombe as a personality who's been in your life that has been a friend, right, in the acknowledgement section.
Yeah.
Now, I wonder, has that ever been difficult? And I don't wish to single Anne out too much, but as far as your journey in politics, has it ever been a sort of block as far as your career and friendships are concerned?
Well, Anne Widdecombe or being gay?
Your sexuality, yeah. Anne Widdecombe, I reference in the sense of her own personal.
Well, the thing with Anne Widdecombe is, and I do count her as a friend, and she counts me as a friend. And look, I get on with people or don't get on with people, not based on whether they have particular views on homosexuality. I invited her to my civil partnership. Now, she didn't come because she was in Spain that weekend. She might not have come anyway, I suppose. But I mean, David Davis has gone on a bit of a journey on this issue where I can remember having a conversation with him about gay adoption, and he was sort of saying, we've got to think of the children. I said, so what are you saying? All gays are paedophiles? I said, well, of course there are some gays that are paedophiles, just as there are straight people who are paedophiles. He came to my civil partnership and was seen shedding a little tear. He swears it was grit in his eye. But I don't think there are many Conservative politicians now who would turn the clock back on these issues. I'd like to think there wouldn't be any. And Anne Widdecombe herself on my programme last year slightly surprised me because I said, would you vote to repeal the equal marriage legislation? And she said, well, what a stupid question. Of course I wouldn't. And so I don't think it's a stupid question given your views on these issues. And she said, well, no, of course I wouldn't do that now. You can't sort of turn the clock back. So if she wouldn't do it, you'd like to think nobody else would. Has it held me back? I mean, I do think I probably would be an MP by now if I wasn't gay, because I was the first candidate to be selected, having told the selection committee that I was gay. Now, that didn't do me many favours in very conservative with the small c North Norfolk. And I became a bit of a poster boy in a sense in the media for it. And even the Observer described me as the gay Conservative candidate. No, I was a Conservative candidate who happened to be gay. You would never talk about the black Conservative candidate or anything like that. So I did remonstrate with the journalist who wrote that. I actually think it's more possibly the profile that I got for my blog and subsequently that may have also played a role in that once you become a pretty well known, there are people that absolutely idolize you and there are people that hate you and think that you are a maverick, that they can't control you. But in the end, I have no regrets. I mean, I would have liked to be an MP. I think I would have been a good MP. But I only ever wanted to be an MP or a radio presenter. And I've got one of the two. Well, there aren't many people in their lives that actually really do achieve one of their main ambitions. And I've done it. And the radio gives me what politics used to give me. It keeps me in the game. I can have some influence at the margins. If I have a listener that has a particular issue that I don't think a particular cabinet minister is aware of, I can pick up the phone and they'll take my call. And I have actually effected change in one or two issues like that. And I've got a platform to speak out. You'll have read the chapter in the book where I talk about being a victim of a sexual assault in the 1990s. And I'm writing a big article on that for the Daily Mail now. Now, I think that my words on that have meant something to some people. I did a 2-hour phone-in on it on Monday night, a very challenging issue to do a phone-in on, and the calls were just heartbreaking. But people felt that they could talk to me about it. And I do think on that issue, on mental health issues in general, people now know that they're not alone. There are other people out there who've gone through exactly the same as them, and it somehow provides a degree of comfort. So I have a platform. I can use it to do good things, and I hope I don't use it to do bad things.
That story reminded you telling your story, or me reading your story rather, because it is in the book, and reminded me of being 17, which was a bit of a mess scene, put it that way. And I was going out clubbing in Newcastle, and it was Halloween, and I was dressed in ripped clothing, fake blood everywhere, and I had stumbled out of this club at God only knows what time, and apparently two older blokes, and I mean much older blokes, carried us off, and they were walking about 2 streets up. And my friend, who was dressed as an angel, I this is a true story, I kid you not, found me with these two older blokes dragging us off, and he said, "Get off him, get off him." And they just dropped us to the floor, and it turned out that the fake blood was no longer just fake blood,
Really?
and that I must have fallen over. And so goodness only knows if that friend, sat there dressed in an angel costume, hadn't seen, who was sat having a midlife crisis, hadn't clocked me, goodness only knows what would have happened. But I wonder, is there a more serious conversation that we need to be having about the... And this isn't me trying to victim blame or anything like that, but at the end of the day, right, I got myself in that condition. I was drunk as a skunk and can't remember any of it. And I wonder to what extent we need a conversation about what alcohol does to us and the vulnerable position that it puts us in.
Well, it does. I didn't have that excuse at all. I put myself in the position.
Him who was drunk, yeah.
Yeah, I put myself in that position because I was horny. Simple as that. But one lesson that I've learned since I've been talking about this is that there are too many people who don't understand the word consent, and that consent to any form of sex can be withdrawn at any time, either just before or even during. And some people don't seem to get that even now. And I do think that's a major issue for discussion. I don't think, I mean, I didn't think about going to the police. I didn't even actually, I think at the time, realize what it was. And it's only now, given all of the discussions that we have, I think, yeah, that was actually sexual. Sorry.
That's all right.
I don't think we realise that things like that are actually sexual assault. I'll give you another example. In about 2000, I was at a Labour Party conference running the bookshop, and the cabinet ministers would come round and have their photos taken with us. And Mo Mowlam came round, and she plonked herself in between me and John, my partner. She put her arms around us, and then while the photographer was taking a picture, proceeded to grope our respective buttocks. Now, you could put that down to the fact that she was in the early stages of a brain tumour, and it had stopped her thinking the way that she would normally think. But I have heard other stories about that from many years before. And I'm thinking, well, if that had been a male cabinet minister and two females, that would be construed as sexual assault. Now, we thought it was funny, I have to say, and wouldn't ever have dreamed about doing anything about it. But I think sexual assault of a male is viewed by society as less serious than on a female. And there may be some logic to that some people think. But male rape is a big thing now, and I think it always has been. And I suspect whatever official statistics there are, they just they don't reflect reality. We know that there is also female on male sexual assault. I mean, that happened to me once. I was just walking down a corridor somewhere where I was working one day, and this woman, who was in a much more powerful position than I was, walked past me and grabbed my groin.
Gosh.
And you think, wow. And I've heard this from a lot of men who've experienced this from women who are in a senior position to them. So it's not just men. Domestic violence, 1 in 4 cases of domestic violence are women on men. Nobody talks about that. I remember saying this to Jackie Smith one day when we were on Sky News. This is quite a few years ago now, and she absolutely refused to accept that could happen. It's not just physical violence, though. It's coercive. violence, if that's a term. It's coercive control. So there are all sorts of these issues which I don't think are discussed enough. I mean, people and you can understand why. It's not a particularly nice thing to discuss, but if we don't discuss it, nothing can be done about it.
Now, the fight in Brighton, you describe that, I think, as the lowest point in your career. Is that right? Would that be... No?
Lowest, is that? And I'm trying to think of what else I could say that was. I mean, it was one of those things that just sort of slightly ran out of control, and the narrative today, and whenever I'm in the news, for good or ill, that's what the left try and beat me with. Even 7 years on, they tweet a video, and it's a highly edited video, and the accusation is that I beat up a poor frail old pensioner. Well, I did nothing of the sort. I mean, I do tell the whole story in the book, but to be brief, Damien McBride was my author. He'd just published his book. He was on the seafront giving an interview on GMTV, and I saw that there was this protester getting in all of the shots. So the viewer at home, they weren't listening to a word that Damien was saying. They were just thinking, oh, I wonder what that protester's going to do. So the sound engineer was trying to maneuver him out of the way. So I went over and very calmly pulled his rucksack back so he came away from the shot. He then sort of wheeled round and threw a punch at me, which missed. But the momentum of that meant that we fell over and were on the floor. And of course, there were other camera crews there. And eventually we both got up. By that time, his Jack Russell had bitten him rather than me, which, I mean, added a slightly comedic element to it. And it developed from there. That same day, Caroline Lucas had been arrested in the Brighton area on a fracking demonstration. And I was then, somebody complained to the police. And I think it was a leading broadcaster that did it sort of just to create a story. And I was doing my radio show and the police tried to come and get me. And I'll always remember the head of the BBC political programme, Sue English, basically told the police I wasn't there and to come back later, which I was very grateful to her for. And then Alistair Campbell turned up and he goes, "What's going on?" And so I explained briefly. He said, "Well, if you need any help, let me know." And then I was told by my producer that at the end of the programme, there was a plain police car that had come to pick me up to take me down to Brighton Nick. I was thinking, oh my God, it was a nothing incident. But once I knew that Caroline Lucas had been charged, I kind of knew the game was up and that they would have to charge me with something. So they cautioned me. Had I not been an LBC radio presenter, I probably wouldn't have accepted the caution. I would have gone to court over it. But hey, I couldn't let that hang over me for God knows how many months. So 2 days later, I had to drive down to Brighton to present myself to be cautioned. And the media were there. I mean, this was a story on the 10 o'clock news, can you believe? And it sort of it completely overshadowed Ed Miliband's conference speech. And I remember thinking, I need to draft a statement to put out. So I started typing out a statement. And I thought, this is far too long. It's far too defensive. So I rang Alistair Campbell and my sister and said, can you just take a look at this? And my sister made some changes, all of which Alistair Campbell accepted, which she was very highly delighted with. And we avoided the press at the police station. But this was, as I say, in 2013, 7 years ago. But it still is a thing on the internet today.
What did that teach you? What did being in the middle of a media firestorm like that, on the 10 o'clock news, overshadowing Ed Miliband, which, by the way, probably can't have been that difficult, can it? But overshadowing Ed Miliband's his conference speech, what did that actually teach you? What life lesson did that teach you? Because it's horrible being at the centre of a media firestorm. It really is. And it's exacerbated.
And you should know.
Quite. It's exacerbated by Twitter, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Twitter was a thing back in those days. But I said to someone the other day, if Twitter had existed in the way that it does now in 2013, LBC would have fired me. I have absolutely no doubt about that. They were brilliant, actually. What did I learn from it? I learned that I should curb my bravado because after it happened, I went back to the hotel and had breakfast with my producer and Matt Harris and Tom Cheel, who now runs LBC. He was political editor at the time. And we were laughing about it. And Tom then saw that a video had come up on the internet, and it sort of all went from there. And I very stupidly then went back to my room and wrote a blog post about it, basically saying, well, I was protecting my author. Any self-respecting publisher would do the same, and I have no regrets. Well, that was a bloody stupid thing to have done. It really was. And when that became part of the story, I thought, well, you've got one of two choices here. You either sort of sit it out and you just don't acknowledge that you've done something that might have been a bit misjudged, or you apologise properly. And I chose the latter action. And there's no point in doing a half-assed apology. If you're going to apologise for something, do it properly. And that's what I did.
Now, I was really struck by the bit on the NHS as well, and the awful experiences that members of your family have had, and whilst using it. And for me, that goes to the very heart about why this, I'm holding up your book for podcast listeners, is so important, because we need to have discussions on this sort of issue, right? If the NHS is failing, you can't have this sort of messiah-like complex when it comes to following of it and speaking of it. If it is failing in areas, that needs to be spoken about and addressed, right?
Well, Nigel Lawson said it's the closest thing we have to organised religion in this country, and he's right. And it is a bit culty. And anybody that questions the NHS in any way is drummed out of the brownies. Now, I wrote a little book about this back in 2015, and it's called The NHS Things That Needed to Be Said. And it stemmed from a lecture I gave at Romford General Hospital. It was at Queen Mary Hospital, I can't remember.
That's in the book as well.
Yeah, and I expected to be roundly condemned by everybody present for what I was saying, because I was delivering some uncomfortable messages. And at the end of it, there were about 100 people there, surgeons, consultants, nurses, administrators, and they all came up to me and said, "You're absolutely right." And I was really gratified by that, because I'm not an expert on the NHS. I did use and I've had good experiences as well as bad experiences. But when the NHS effectively kills both your parents, and I genuinely know that that's what happened. Now, I'm not saying that they would have necessarily lived for a lot longer, but there were so many things that went wrong. And of course, what happens is that when things go wrong like that, they capitalize on your grief, because they know that you won't want to keep it in your mind forever and ever. And I just thought, I can't, if I put in an official complaint on this is going to go on for ages, and I just can't cope with that. So I didn't. And then Anne Clwyd, the Labour MP, it happened to her husband, and she did do something about it. And she was appointed by David Cameron to launch a full inquiry into what was going on. And I thought, well, if she can do it, I can do it. So I then did make a formal complaint to Adam Brooks Hospital in Cambridge, which is one of our leading teaching hospitals. But if at that time, and I hope to God it's improved now, if you were an older person, you did not want to be in Adam Brooks Hospital. And it was just the fact there was no continuity of care. In 3 weeks, my mother saw, I think, 100, 150 different nurses. Well, no one's telling me that you can provide care if you have a different nurse every shift, every day of the week. They had no clue what to feed her. And in the end, my sisters effectively operated a shift system so that she was never alone with a nurse. And you think, well, that's not how it should be. Yeah. And you have to question things like that. And when Jeremy Hunt became Health Secretary, that's what he did. And I was really gratified that he did. He said the NHS has got to be a more caring service, and that he was absolutely right. But he got dog's abuse for it, and probably knew he would do. And look, the NHS does some fantastic things, but if you can't criticise it for the things it gets wrong, it'll never get them right. You look at the outcomes in all sorts of things where, given what we spend on the NHS, we're not getting the outcomes that we should be getting in too many areas.
And in the same way in which we look around the world as far as responses to COVID-19 are concerned, why can we not do the same when it comes to our healthcare system?
Well, I think that's a very difficult area, because there are all sorts of reasons why I think this country has had far more deaths proportionately to the population than many other countries. I don't blame the NHS in itself for that. I think actually, one of the main things at the beginning of this was to protect the NHS and make sure that it could cope. And that is one of the few successes the government has had. There are all sorts of other issues which we could spend 2 hours talking about as to what else could have been done differently. But you look at Germany, which is held up as the best country of having dealt with coronavirus. Well, although I had a caller last night who was absolutely disputing that. He said the figures are just completely wrong. But they have a very decentralized health system where it's all of the different Bundesländer that control their own systems. It's a insurance-based system. And I think there are structural defects in that we don't actually have a national health service anyway. And we have 4 different health services. And if you look at, and we probably ought to have sort of the East Anglian Health Service or the South East Health Service or even the Kent Health Service, even the Sussex Health Service, because what's right in Newcastle isn't necessarily right in Tunbridge Wells. There are different demands. Health priorities are very different in different parts of the country. But you can't have that discussion at the moment about making any meaningful changes because it is this sacred cow.
Now, staying on the topic of healthcare, I've got 2 more questions, by the way, so you can go shortly, I promise. You mention mental health, and I wonder if you think that there's a link between the rise of social media and the decline, or rather the uptick in people being diagnosed with mental health conditions. Do you think social media is actually making our mental health problems worse? For example, if you spend too long on Twitter, do you actually find it makes you feel a bit glum?
I'm pretty resilient. I'm not going to say that if I get persistent abuse on Twitter, it doesn't have an effect, because it's inevitable that it would do sometimes. But I've never had difficulties with mental health, at least I don't think I have. But it is a subject that really fascinates me. And we do an hour-long mental health section of the programme every Thursday at 9. And we started it in March because we recognised that people were becoming incredibly anxious about what the future held. Social media can exacerbate, I think, existing mental health issues. I'm not sure that on its own it makes things worse. It can make things better because you can actually form almost support groups on things like Facebook and find people on Twitter who are going through the same thing as you are. So I wouldn't say that it's all bad, but if you let it get to you, it probably can have quite a deleterious effect. And I think anxiety is something that really has risen over the last few months for understandable reasons. I had an email last night from somebody who said, seeing people wearing face masks makes me more anxious. Well, in theory, it ought to make you less anxious. And I'm sure for some people it does, but it just goes to show everybody is different.
I mean, I'm not going to lie to you, I think over recent years, I've definitely struggled more than I ever have before with anxiety. I mean, I've always been a bit of an anxious person, but I definitely think Twitter has played a large part in making mine a bit worse, to the extent where I've found that I have to just take days off of it, which you probably haven't realised because I'm on it quite a lot, but where I just have to take a step back.
But the thing is, you say, I mean, we talked about the Brighton incident, which is probably the most high-profile bad incident I've had in my life. You've had quite a few of these issues over the years, and you have worked out a way to cope with it, I guess. And one of those ways is to not look at all the stream of vitriol that you often get. And it's not easy to cope with because, look, we are human beings. Just because you and I happen to be on the right wing does not make us people who don't have feelings. Mm-hmm. I think everybody. I think there are very few people in this world who actually revel in being hated. It's a natural human instinct to want people to like us, and I think that's Boris Johnson is really guilty of that. He can't understand why people don't like him. I remember a couple of questions that he was asked in the leadership contest in the hustings that I hosted, where he looked at me, and if you drew a speech bubble above his head, it was, why doesn't this person like me? Well, not everyone is going to like you. We all have to come to terms with that. I don't understand often why people don't like me, but I have to accept that they don't. I'm not going to go out of my way to try and make them like me, because they've probably made up their minds. So everyone has a different coping mechanism for it.
Now, finally then, I wonder if you might sum up...
Is this a killer question, Darren?
It's not actually. It is just summing up everything that we've discussed as neatly as you possibly can, which is no easy task, by the way, because it's a very readable book, but it does obviously give us time to assess everything over 200 and odd pages.
Nearly 300. It's good. It's good value at $12.99. You know,
it is. It's a bargain. They should definitely buy it. I'm telling you. But I wonder if you might sum up for us why attempts to improve public discourse are not only good for advancing debate and progress, actually, but they are actually necessary for a person's own self-improvement as well. That makes us better people.
This is not a self-help book. It's not a motherhood and apple pie book. It's not a come and sing Kumbaya with me book. I was very conscious when I was writing it that I was coming up with all sorts of dilemmas and problems, but offering precious little solutions. So at the end, there is a section as an epilogue, 50 ways that we can improve our public discourse. And it's all about what can be done different on social media and the mainstream media, et cetera, et cetera. And most of it is pretty blindingly obvious, actually. It's just that I've written it down in one place. I'm not pretending to have any innovative suggestions for this. But I mean, if you're on Twitter and somebody calls you a twat, wait a bit before you tweet back to them, you're a fucking twat, because it just escalates from there. I mean, that's a very simple thing to do. And I just think that it is partly about trying to be nicer to each other. And I know that sounds absolute wanky. Yeah, wow, that's exactly the right word. I know it does. But I have tried to, throughout my life, get on with people who hold different views to me. That's why Yasmin Alibi-Brown is a friend. That's why I get on like a house on fire with Jackie Smith. I don't deliberately set out to make enemies of people who don't agree with most of the things that I believe in. And I think that's why I've only ever had one Labour politician complain about an interview with me. I've had plenty of Conservatives do it. Because they know that I'm going to treat them with respect. They know that they're going to get a fair crack, a fair hearing. And that's what it should be about. I'm not looking for gotcha moments all the time. I mean, I've had my fair share of news hits out of interviews that I've done, but it's not because I've deliberately gone into an interview thinking, I'm going to get you, you tosser. And there are too many interviewers that I'm afraid have that attitude, because they think it's all about them. They think that they aren't going to be able to climb the greasy pole in the media by doing what people sometimes accuse me of as soft interviews. They're not soft interviews. It's just that I don't shout at people. I'll have a conversation rather than a sort of aggressive interview. And I think the listener or the viewer actually gets more out of it that way. So I think it's just about treating people with respect. And that is difficult on Twitter sometimes. And look, I've been as guilty as anyone of getting involved in needless Twitter arguments. But I do try and moderate things on Twitter now, where if somebody calls me a twat, I might call them a muppet, which is somehow more wounding. But you don't have to go down the sweary route, even now I'm still, somebody this morning, I was so tempted to really let them have it. But I thought, well, it'd be a bit ironic the day before the book comes out to really say that. So I'll do it on Friday instead.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, anyway, speaking of the book, everyone should get it ordered because it is really, really good and just what we needed.
And can I just say, if you want a signed copy, very happy to do that. Just order it via politicos.co.uk and I'll put whatever dedication in you want. Or otherwise,
that's a challenge.
You can, or quite. You can. I've had some very choice ones, I can assure you. You can. I've already done. Can you believe it? I thought I might get 100 people wanting signed copies. I've had 950 so far, which is fantastic. But I spent the last week or two in front of the television watching the cricket, signing books, and then I packaged them all myself because people think I must lead this glamorous life, but I actually have spent the last 2 weeks packaging books. But if you don't want a signed copy, try and buy it from your local independent bookstore, or if you have to, from Amazon.
I was about to say, wow, you must have had a very sore wrist after that weekend. And then I thought...
I'm not
Anyway.
I'm not going there. I'm not going there because it would be creepy, and I'm not doing it.
That's a marvellous way to end the show. Ian Dale, thank you
Basically,
very much.
calling me a wanker. Thank you, Darren. After all I've done for you.
Cheers, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Reasoned is a grassroots organisation that relies on support from people like yourself who want us to continue producing our free-thinking, high-quality content. You can rest assured whatever you donate, big or small, will be put back into ensuring we win the battle of ideas. Thank you for your support.